Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am in front of this headstone to Richard Turpin. Dick Turpin is more commonly known. So Dick Turpin was one of the most notorious highwaymen of the early 18th century. Highway is obviously a road, and a highwayman, he would be on horseback, often masking his face or wearing a scarf up to here, his tricorn hat low to try and obscure as much of his visage as possible. So there were knights of the road. They would go out and they would see people coming and they would pull a pistol on them saying your money or your life. They'd often operate in small gangs. They didn't want too large a gang because that was too conspicuous. So they would relieve people of their valuables. They didn't bother robbing poor people because they'd have almost nothing on them, just a few pennies. It was wealthy people. If they're very daring, they'd rob a horse-drawn coach. A horse-drawn coach had a person of quality in it who would be carrying a lot of money. Checks were just invented, often not accepted. Who'd have jewelry, who'd have watches and so on. But it was audacious to rob a horse-drawn carriage because this man would often have an armed guard with a musket there. He might have a few. He might have some of his postilions might be armed. He might even have sort of armed guards on horseback. Remember, firearms were very easy to buy in those days. Strictly speaking, Roman Catholics were not permitted to buy firearms, but by the mid-18th century that wasn't enforced. So they were obviously putting their life on the line every time they robbed these people. So life was cheap, just a few shillings. That was grand larceny. That was enough to send someone to the gallows. Anyway, Dick Turpin was born in Essex in 1705. That's a county just outside London to the northeast. And he grew up in a middle-class family. He went to school, which I can't go without saying in those days, because perhaps only half of children went to school, slightly more girls than boys. Some learnt to read, but not to write. But anyway, he had no difficulty with literacy. And so he set himself up as a butcher. So he prospered in his trade. And butchers were reasonably well off because meat was pricey. Most people couldn't afford meat very often. Some people were eating meat twice a week. Some people almost could never afford it. So that's why poorer people were often shorter, malnourished. Their bones didn't grow properly because they didn't get enough protein or indeed calcium. Because meat was so expensive because a lot of animal diseases we couldn't cure in those days. Animals died a lot sooner of various illnesses. We couldn't fatten them up. We hadn't done so much selective breeding. They're often muscular, scrawny, but faster, and so on. So we had no battery farms as those to bring the price of meat down. So in the late 20th century, the meat became something that most people eat on a daily basis. Anyhow, but Dick Turpin, he wasn't happy with this tedious bourgeois domesticity, and he decided that he wanted to be more venturesome. So he too became a knight of the roads, and he went out poaching deer as well, part of the notorious Gregory Gang, and poaching deer was punishable by death. Sometimes he was punished by blinding or indeed castration. These weren't the king's deer, but the private parks, often walled off, often with fences. So poaching was treated very severely. There was the bloody code at the time. And remember, there were about 200 death penalty offences in England and Wales up until the 1820s, until Sir Robert Peel's Home Secretary reformed the penal code. So actually, common law was much more savage than Sharia law was at the time. And the trials back then would not be considered fair by modern standards. So, but he and his gang, they stole sheep as well as venison, which we could sell on his shop. But people became a little bit suspicious about this. They also committed armed robberies. They committed burglaries. One of his gang committed at least one rape. People occasionally resisted these robberies, and they were killed. So he decided to row further away from Essex. Things were getting a bit too hot for them there, and he came up to Yorkshire. He stayed in the town of Brough. He posed as a horse dealer because, of course, he'd stolen people's horses, and a horse was very valuable. £5 would have been an average price for a horse. £5 was obviously worth so much more in these days. It's difficult to convert it. Put it these days, this way, a judge was paid something like £3,000 a year, which is a huge sum of money at the time. Anyway, so but people became suspicious about his identity. He had some sort of altercation where he drew a gun on two men and threatened to kill them. He didn't actually shoot them, but then the Justice of the Peace ordered that he be arrested. A Justice of the Peace is a magistrate, is a low-level judge in the criminal courts. And magistrates, they were unpaid. They were pillars of the community who volunteered to do this, and they obviously had to be literate, a reasonably respectable person, a gentleman farmer, or a doctor or a solicitor or whoever it was, or a well-to-do merchant, and it was quite an honour to be a magistrate and put JP behind your name, Justice of the Peace. They ordered him to be arrested. We didn't have police as such until the 1820s. They were parish constables, often very poorly paid, no uniform, no regulations really. Sometimes a hue and cry would go out, arrest that person if they think a crime had just been committed. Anyhow, so Dick Turpin, he was arrested and he gave his name as John Palmer. He was arraigned at the York Assizes, as in when the trials came up, because there were itinerant judges travelling from one courthouse to another around the county, this being the largest county in England. And so he might have been convicted of minor crimes, he might have got away with it. They had no proof he'd stolen anything at this stage. So he might have got a short spell in jail, been able to pay a fine or something like that. There was also transportation. That was a fate worse than death. Transportation to America, usually to the southern colonies. But anyway, he didn't have too much reason to fear until he made a fatal mistake of writing a letter to people in Essex. And now the penny postal stamps didn't come in till the mid-19th century. You sent a letter through Royal Mail and it was paid by the recipient. You know, the postman knock on your house, we have a letter for you, do you want it? You have to pay for it. If not, it'll be destroyed. But anyway, his handwriting was recognised in Essex by his teacher, the man who taught him to write, and said, oh, I think this John Palmer in York, I think that is Dick Turpin. Remember, the population was much, much smaller back then, all right? The population of England and Wales only about 4 million in those days, whereas now it'd be something like almost 60 million. So fewer people around and not so many people could read and write. But anyway, that man came up from York and he identified him at the York Assizes. So he was, more witnesses were able to come forward to say, yes, you know, he stolen horses. He was convicted of stealing 2 horses, and that was a capital offence straight off. So he'd been arrested in October 1735, and he was condemned to death in March 1736. And 16 days later, he was due to be executed. So the day before his death, he purchased a new suit and a pair of boots. He paid 5 mourners, people to rend the air with lamentations at his obsequies. People wanted a good send-off, especially someone as vain as he was. So he was tied up in an open cart, horse-drawn cart, so all the crowd could see. It was open justice in those days, and he was conveyed just south of York to near where York Racecourse is, and indeed horse races were there. It was almost a carnival atmosphere, and, well, carnet was going to be failed at the time. And so they wanted maximum publicity to operate as a deterrent to the public and to see that the ends of justice were served, that you get your just deserts. If you commit these crimes, you will pay with your life for it. So Dick Turpin was hanged by a former highwayman who had been pardoned. And it was the short drop, so left to dangle on the end of the rope for up to 20 minutes. They died from strangulation, not from damage to the central nervous system. That short drop only came in the late 19th century. So an agonizing death, but supposedly he was of good cheer and he was jovial to the very end, cracking jokes with people who were there. So there were lots of accounts of sort of speeches from the scaffold right before people were turned off meaning hanged. But for some reason he passed into legend. He was one of the most prolific highwaymen and highly successful. He got away with it for several years, roving over England. Because remember, there were no photos back then. You had to have an eyewitness identification. And you know, these things can be challenged in court. Are you sure? How can we trust one person's word against another? Nobody now doubts that he was a highwayman, and he answered with his life for his crimes. So he was buried, his body was dug up by body snatchers. I think they were trying to sell it to a school of anatomy. Often these things were sold immediately. I'm not sure why they were stealing it if they hadn't sold it straight away, because the bodies of condemned were sometimes given to medical schools immediately. There were hospitals in York, or there was no university in York until the 1960s. But anyway, so the authorities recovered the body and they reburied it. We think here, we don't know exactly where in the churchyard, and they may have put quicklime on it. And so long as the body is dry, quicklime will cause the body to dissolve very quickly. There's some sort of acid in a matter of hours, like John George Hay, the acid bath murderer. So in the 19th century, these popular plays about Dick Turpin came out, talking about his feats, and he became a folk hero, a sort of modern Robin Hood. He was fighting for the rich against the poor, which is largely bunkum. He didn't give any of his ill-gotten gains to the needy. The lucre was all strictly for himself, so he's completely financially motivated. There was no sense of social justice driving his crimes. And there's a story of his horse Brown Bess and how he rode from York to London in one night. All these are 19th century inventions, so it was a very popular show. in the theatre, in circuses, if you really had a horse, Dick Turpin. So that was Dick Turpin, who died on the 7th of April, 1739. Sorry, not 36. But there we are.